as we saw just this last weekend, a lot of people who are getting motivated to be more involved in the political world more
Right. No,
generally.
no Kings protests were happening across the country on Saturday, and yeah, it is interesting because what was the exact timing on radical empathy? What was 2021? When did
It
that
came
come?
out right. It came out in 2021,
Okay.
actually. So,
Yeah.
that's why I was talking about how long it takes a book to get published because
Right.
I've been working on that book before the summer of 2020.
Right.
Um, and so I just finished the full draft of it right before the George Floyd murder.
Oh, wow.
And then, so I finished the final version, with all the proofreading and everything with my publisher around
Yeah.
October, November, and it
Uh-huh.
came out in February.
Okay.
And so, um, but that summer, I had already started working with different groups. So one of the first groups I worked with was the UC Berkeley Office of the President, asked me to come in and do some training with them on, not, and, I don't talk a lot about DEI because DEI, it's not just because the DEI has been demonized by folks, but um, it's also been a problem in terms of the way DEI has been implemented,
Hmm.
which is that a lot of times it's let's do a 1 hour online workshop
Yeah.
or training, let's do
Hmm.
and so a lot of times what people call DEI work was not very in depth. It wasn't
Yeah.
really getting at the underlying issues. And
Was frequently
so,
frequently delivered after George Floyd in the midst of an ongoing pandemic, so like
mhm,
the implementation fidelity there might not be top of the line. It was a confusing time, and even some of that was probably done in Zoom. And then
mhm.
there were, like with anything, people are opportunistic around the next hype cycle around something. So a lot of people want to jump in, and it's not like there was a lot of like national standards around what good DEI training
Yeah.
was. And
And
plus they're leaving out the B, Terry,
exactly.
you know?
Yes, the belonging,
Right?
DEIB.
Yeah.
And that's a lot of what I talk about in, both my workshops and so on. But, the interesting thing also, with a lot of the workshops and trainings we did is that they weren't just one-offs.
Hmm.
We tried to do things that had, that were sustained, that
Yeah.
and also helping people to understand that it's not the job of us as women and minorities to, be the ones to do all the work. um,
Right.
it really is, I'm a firm believer that you're the most important people for any kind of work around inclusion, belonging, et cetera, is your leadership, and they have to
Right.
buy in.
Right.
Because when leadership buys in, then it means that you have basically a understanding that this is an important part of what the organization is doing, and
Hmm.
that's really one of the things I hone in on with some of the stories I tell in this book is that it's not just about, obviously people making demands is really important, but it's a bottom up and top down approach that really can make things more institutionalized.
Yeah. And what struck me is that it's post backlash. And I
Hmm.
feel like a lot of the framing of the backlash is fine. Like, and there were places where folks probably needed to get pushback, frankly, and like that great. Like, but then like all backlashes, overreaches, goes too far, but then it doesn't just continue in perpetuity. Things are cyclical. And, you know, I was also struck by the progression from apathy to empathy to action. And, this is maybe following through on the action side of the equation here. And then speaking of action, No Kings just happened.
Hmm.
In some ways, that timing I think is probably great for the launch of your book. Like, how are you thinking about how reckoning and radical empathy connects to some of the real life lessons we're all learning around things like No Kings?
Right. Well, I one of the sections of the books talks about this, as you mentioned, this moving from apathy to empathy.
Hmm.
And, as an academic, I look into the research and talk to, colleagues. And I love this quote from sociologist Alden Morris. He says that people have to see themselves as oppressed in order to push for change,
Hmm.
noting that injustice generates anger and righteous indignation, which organizers can summon in strategizing to address the pains of oppression.
Yeah.
Love and empathy can be evoked to build solidarity and trust among protesters. Far from being irrational distractions, emotions, along with transformed mental attitudes, are critical to achieving social change.
Hmm.
And that was very affirming for me because of my focus on empathy.
Right.
And the reason I call it radical empathy is because it's about taking action.
Hmm.
Empathy is one thing. And it's really interesting because what that quote I think is referring to the fact that people who once they feel oppressed or feel so, like they have some skin in the game are more likely to come out, and that the emotion and the love and empathy are an important component. And I see all over social media since Saturday people like, well, why did what does protest really do? What change
Mm.
can protest create? It's the important thing, and I've seen also a lot of people talking about this aspect of it, is that it's so important for people to see themselves as part of a group.
Yeah.
That coming back to belonging is that
Hmm.
we in doing those protests we set it up so that people see they're not alone,
Yeah.
and that and some people, well, we aren't being serious enough. It's like, well, whatever works, right?
Yeah.
I mean,
I mean, I don't
um
know. I heard the vibes were impeccable, and there were about 7 million people spread across over 1,000, right? There were like
no,
thousands.
2000.
That's incredible if you think about the grassroots kind of local activity, which is actually a little different than the way stuff has been pretty corporatized around like collective action in a lot of ways, especially through like social media and some of the trends we've seen recently. This one does, I guess it's indivisible, and a few other groups are kind of behind this, but it's almost they're very intentional about pushing kind of the local action, and I think it does tie to a lot of the research I'm hearing around like you know, a lot of the radicalization and polarization that we're seeing now is because people don't actually sit at the same tables. They don't, go to the same supermarkets, and like they don't kind of build difference into just like the fabric of life.
Mhm,
So like they like freak out, and it's almost like an exposure problem. And then the flip side is true, like in oppressive times, like people might feel really isolated in that like this is kind of weird, right? This kind of feels tyrannical. Like, I don't know, is it me? And you can really feel reassured in your worldview when you're kind of with people who you look them in the eye and they're like, no, it's not you. I kind of am seeing the same thing. And
mhm,
and to me that's like sharing a worldview is empathy.
mhm. Yeah, well, it is in a sense. I mean, we talk about empathy, and of course, I talk about 6 steps for radical empathy, but I mean, empathy is putting yourself in somebody else's shoes. And you're right in the sense that, it's also seeing somebody else's worldview. But the other side of it is that empathy is not absolution.
Hmm.
Um, and I think we need to remember that that certain people have been, bashing empathy. Um, but the reality is
Haters gonna hate, Terry.
yeah, exactly. Um, and the reality is that empathy is, yes, it's putting yourself in somebody else's shoes, but it's not, empathy is not absolution. It's not saying just because I put myself in somebody else's shoes doesn't mean I'm going to all of a sudden change my perspectives or
Yeah.
even be sympathetic necessarily to
Hmm.
what somebody else is feeling.
Right.
We talk about sympathy and compassion and so on. And empathy, I think, is a step beyond that. It's really
Hmm.
trying to see things from somebody else's perspective so that you can find ways to connect if possible. And, the reality is some people you just can't connect with.
Right.
And that's just the way the world is. As human beings, we can only go so far in our ability to identify with or put ourselves, in a position that helps us to we may try to understand, but there is evil in the world, right?
Yeah. Yeah, and then empathy backlash is real. Like
Hmm.
anything that gets some shine, like the haters gonna hate comment is kind of true. Like it's like, oh, that's making impact. What can we do to kind of take that concept down,
Hmm.
which is just a reality, and that's why I think it's good to have positive things to affirm about why this thing is good, and that's why I think your point about empathy not being the end result, it's almost like a tool or a bridge that can kind of get you to the better end results. And that's why this book I think is good in that it's almost like running through the I know you're a runner. It's like running through the tape on the radical empathy concept.
Yeah, it's saying that there's different levels for how you can create change, starting from the individual level, but going all the way up to international organizations and
Yeah,
how they've gone about creating change. Every chapter has, you know, ways to work on the concepts that are discussed in each chapter. There's really it's important for people to understand that it's okay to be frustrated. It's okay to feel like am I really making change? And it's important to think about how the change might start just with yourself, right?
yeah,
And then that you can build out from that. So that's why the book is structured the way it is I'm trying with each chapter to say, look, here's what you can do as an individual, here's what you can do with your organizations, here's what you can do with government and politics, here's what you can do with at the international level. And corporations, I highlight L'Oreal and Montreal, who I worked with, and I never worked with Intel, but I was always admired the way they approached issues of diversity. And the funny thing to me, I have this discussion with my husband all the time, who's an engineer, is there's this backlash to DEI and so on, and but if you
right.
look at
The tech bros have pushed back and they own the valley. That's the story.
right, but they don't own the valley. The
Uh,
AMD, look at any major corporation outside of Facebook and Apple,
yeah,
and they are headed by people
yeah.
and women of color.
Nvidia, yeah, yeah.
AMD just got a huge boost with the. My husband worked for AMD.
Ah,
Yeah, they just
okay.
got a huge boost with the investment by OpenAI and so on,
Mm,
and
hmm.
they're led by a woman of color.
Yeah,
And that's the interesting thing to me is that if you look across Silicon Valley, it is incredibly diverse. My
right.
husband's a white guy. He's always been a minority in his workspace, right?
Yeah,
And
right. Yep.
and that's why so much of what's happening, I study immigration politics and so on. So much of what's happening is actually going to hurt a lot of the companies where they're,
Oh
cutting
yeah,
back on
I mean the
international students.
H1Bs is going to be
Yeah.
really damaging to our competitive positioning as like especially around AI, but really around innovation in general. If you look at a lot of the startups that the entrepreneurial activity that's kind of baked into the kind of pathway around an H1B and some of these other tools. And then the same thing around higher ed, like our whole research infrastructure benefits from a diversity of thought and from also being able to source some of the best talent globally. Um, it's kind of a fool's errand to think like less external input will lead to more innovation. Like closed societies, North Korea is a great example. Closed societies are less innovative, because their whole model is about suppressing diversity. Hegseth was just driving me crazy too. Like it's that whole idea of like you can't hold two things to be true at the same time, where he's trying to say like diversity is not our strength, unity of purpose is our strength. And it's like, come on, dumbass, it's both. Like it's a both end. It's not an either or. It's like you can have unity of purpose, but you can also understand that more perspectives when rationally evaluated will make the
Hmm.
collective intelligence greater. It's like a pretty,
Hmm.
it's not that ex
Oh, I mean, this goes back to when I was in an undergrad, and the studies of IBM and groupthink and all of
Yes,
that.
right.
I mean, it's like the last thing you want is a lack of diversity of any kind, in where you're making major decisions.
Exactly.
And most companies have and it's not just, for companies, it's not just that they recognize that groupthink is a bad thing.
Yeah.
It's also that they recognize that, no matter what you do, the world is diverse and changing. And they aren't
Right.
just their market isn't only in the United States. Their market,
Hmm.
you know,
Totally. Yeah.
the the reality is that people of people, white European background are the global minority. The global
Right.
majority is not what Pete Hegseth thinks it.
Right. Well,
And
yeah.
the reality is, if they want to sell their, L'Oreal is a great example for me. They want to sell to all the entire world.
Yeah, like
you know
new markets, broader, like, growth there. If you look at where population is going by like 2050, how much growth there is in Africa while the West kind of dwindles and,
Yeah, but that's where the fear comes from, right?
mhm.
It's that fear of losing power. People in the US here, oh, well, I think the state of California, certain states are already majority minority, which I hate to
Right,
use that
right.
term, but
Yeah,
and without understanding that, we can do things that lift all boats, right?
yeah,
And there's no reason that, to think that, because one group is larger than another, all of a sudden, you're going to
yeah.
be oppressed.
Because I thought this was a cool angle that we should talk a little more about is like the economics
Yes.
of empathy and the economics of like racism and exclusionary thinking versus being more inclusive and, broader in your vision for like the upside of everyone's, I think you called it like economic uplift. Um,
hmm
can you expand on that a little? I thought that was cool.
Well, the reality is that when, actually, I was just listening to a thing on healthcare this morning and the ACA and all that. And that's
Hmm.
a great example of this. Is so if you healthcare, because if you're not healthy, you're actually more of a burden on the system,
It's
right?
expensive. Yeah. Hmm.
It's expensive. So, that's why the big focus of the ACA and before that, the Massachusetts healthcare system,
Romney care.
what, yep, exactly, was about preventative care.
Yeah.
And, right now you can
That's
go
good economics.
Exactly. Right now, you can go and get a flu shot or a COVID shot for free
Hmm.
in most places,
Yeah.
because of the Affordable Care Act,
Right.
and or Obamacare, as some people call it.
Yeah.
And so, from an economic perspective, if more people are, getting that preventive care, then fewer people are going into the emergency rooms and hospitals, and
Right.
fewer people are dying young, and all those things um, help us all to be better off, right? And so we have a tendency to see things as zero sum. And, if I'm losing a piece of the pie, then because somebody else is doing better, then, it's bad for me. And the reality is that's not the way our economy works. And,
Right.
our economy works better when people are, you know, all thriving and productive and not getting sick and,
Yeah.
um, being able to, pay taxes, And
Right.
one of the things that drives me crazy is that, in order for, companies to thrive, people need to be able to buy things. And
Right.
so people
Yeah.
need to be paid a reasonable wage.
Right.
People need to be able to afford housing. I mean, I have a very good friend who is doing amazing work with homeless people. And, if those people, we can pull those people out of
Yeah.
whatever problems they're experiencing, that's better for all of us. And
Hmm.
we, from a, kind of more theoretical perspective, we have this system that, creates hierarchies. And so, we unfortunately have a system that's designed that certain people are not going to thrive and do well.
Yeah.
And,
It's almost like when you're waiting in the airport and they add like group seven and group, it becomes increasingly like punitive. Like, how
mhm.
bad can we make? You don't understand. You travel too much, and I know this is not something you understand. But it's like I think it was when I actually got like the easy access. I started realizing like, oh wow, like they're not doing it because they have to. They're doing it in part so that the people who pay more for the thing see how bad it is for the people who don't, you know? So it's almost like,
Hmm.
and that's the same thing around working class that I think is interesting, where like I think when people say working class, I heard this from you, like usually it's like code for like white working class, and that politically they're almost dog whistles can appeal to the white working class, but not really recognize that things like housing security and like, healthcare as like a human right, like those things appeal to all Americans.
That's
And
right. I mean, on that point, I was talking to some folks about, the whole housing situation and how, different cities have trouble creating more housing for various reasons, whether it's geographic or just zoning, et cetera. And but communities have found ways to do better on that front by building up, by supporting low income housing, and getting out of that NIMBY mode. So,
yeah,
that whole NIMBY thing is a classic example of, people wanting to protect their space and
yeah,
not, oh, I don't want the regulations to ease up because that means my property value might go down. And the reality is that's you don't know that.
yeah,
I mean, if we're all doing better, your property values might go up, but that doesn't matter. I mean, we
yeah,
should care about the fact that people who, do a lot of the important work in our community should be able to afford where
right,
they live,
yeah,
including police officers,
yeah,
all kinds of emergency uh responders, all of
yeah.
that.
It's almost like a scarcity mindset and
Hmm.
a zero sum game sort of game theory versus more like abundance thinking and like a non-zero sum game where like we actually all can net better if we adjust our mindset. And I feel like AI is going to push us there. I hope, I don't know if you see, I thought Deborah's question is a good one. Could you share a story from your teaching
It's
work?
Darren.
Oh, sorry, Darren. There you go.
Yeah, I saw Darren's. I like Darren's question too.
Yeah, yeah.
So a profound shift. Well, first I'll start with myself because that's the reason I wrote Radical Empathy is because I had to have a profound shift in my own thinking. I struggled a lot with accepting who I am in many ways. I talk about my 20s and my years of cognitive dissonance and feeling like people are always trying to put me in a box.
Mm,
And that's why I think a really important component of radical empathy is being, first of all, willingness to be vulnerable, because I had to be vulnerable
mm.
to open up to the fact that I didn't feel comfortable with who I was.
Yeah.
And secondly, um, uh, you know, being grounded in who you are. And so I did a lot of work around becoming grounded in who I am and
Hmm.
having empathy for myself, right?
Right,
But
right. And there's an
you
interesting
know,
point there too. I think just in terms of the white male bravado that's getting paraded around all the time, and like they're not being vulnerable. Like they're actually saying that's not the pathway, that the dynamics are such that like always being in command, never admitting you're wrong, like that's the right way to act. So like it's almost like doubly tricky for you. It's a little bit of gaslighting too, where it's almost like if I want to compete with that, I need to behave the same way, as
mhm,
opposed to no, I actually need to like let go of that at times and understand that
mhm.
vulnerability actually is a strength.
Well, yeah, exactly. And everything shows that vulnerability is strength. Basically, not being willing to be open to admitting mistakes, things like that. That just gets us into more trouble. But
Hmm.
I want to come back to Darren's question because I do have a really good example. I was doing a workshop for some folks at Arizona State University, and we really dug into things like their hiring practices and how do we get more diverse people into the pipeline. And I explained to them, first of all, you have to understand what is your pipeline. And I have
Right,
to say, I've had this discussion with a lot of clients
right.
that
You
they
did
don't.
that at McGill, right? That was a big part of
Oh yeah,
your
yeah, and
initiative there, right? Yeah.
yes, I mean. it's like, and I tell you, because I was working on helping them hire more Black faculty at McGill, and the question I always get is, well, how do we find these people? And so one of the things people have to understand is you have to get out of your comfort zone. You have to be willing to go beyond your typical recruitment practice. One company whose name I won't mention was based in a city where they would just go to the local university. Well,
Hmm.
the local university isn't very diverse.
Right.
And if you aren't going beyond that, then you're just, and I remember seeing a post that was, it's like, well, why shouldn't we, hire people we feel comfortable with? And so it's like, well, because first of all, you are just reifying bias by hiring people who look like you and act
Yeah.
like you and so on.
Yeah.
And also, that's where not where the talent pool is.
Yeah.
If
It's
you,
also like it's intellectual inbreeding, you know,
yeah.
like you're only gonna get so much out of it's the old trope about like, your corporate board is like 9 60-year-old white guys in a dark suit with
Hmm.
a red tie. Like there's been a bit of an awakening. It gets back to the kind of group dynamics of good decision making and like collective intelligence. When done right, it does net out better. Are there stories from your teaching? Because like you do, I don't know how much I'm assuming folks know, but maybe you could share a little more like
Yeah, I'm a
what you
professor of political
do. Yeah,
science. Yes.
exactly. Yeah.
And I do teach. And even this semester I'm teaching a senior seminar and and actually I do have my students read radical because I want them to know who I am.
Yeah.
So I do have them read parts of Radical Empathy. The interesting thing there is I was just having this conversation yesterday with a colleague who is struggling with how do I deal with, he also teaches on race, and I
Hmm.
do immigration and race.
Yep.
And he was saying how he had trouble with some more conservative students. And I said, well, look, the first thing I do in my class, first of all, is I have them read my book so they
Yeah.
understand that I was somebody we all have bias, right?
Yeah. Right.
And I'm not going to stand up here and pretend that I don't have bias or that I know the answers to everything. Um,
Right.
and that's a very vulnerable position to be in as a professor.
Yeah.
But I found that students are willing to be more open. I was very happy last semester. I had a few more conservative students who felt like they could speak up in class
Yeah.
I was pretty happy with how they, worked through their research papers and things like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so by it's a lot about being an example. And so even when I was working with folks at ASU and getting them to understand, I mean, they came to the realization we have to change the way we advertise our jobs. My students come to the realization I don't know history the way I thought I did. I
Right.
mean, this is a thing that comes up over and over in the classes that I teach. Even when I was at McGill, I remember talking to a woman who grew up in Congo, but she'd gone to all Belgian schools because they still have a lot of, European
Right.
oriented Belgian schools.
Yeah.
And she had never learned any African history.
Hmm. That's
And
crazy.
a lot of Canadians tell me that, because I teach about Canadian immigration,
Right.
politics, and history. A lot of
Yeah.
Canadians say, "Oh, I didn't know the history."
Yeah.
A lot of people don't know that the first groups to be excluded from immigration in the U.S., Canada, Australia, et cetera, were Chinese
Hmm.
because of
Right.
Chinese exclusion laws.
Sure.
And anyway, I could go on and
Don't get me started. I'm going to start talking about
on.
my Irish ancestors, and we'll lose the entire audience. So we don't need to do
Yes,
that. You also talk a lot about mutual aid lately.
yes,
Can you share a little more on that?
yeah. So the reason I've been focusing more on mutual aid since a year ago, approximately, is that when we're in a situation where the government can no longer be trusted to provide support, we have to turn to each other.
Hmm.
And what I mean by mutual aid is, especially for people who feel like, well, what can I do? How can I create change? It's really important to look around at your community and say, where are people falling through the cracks? Where are people finding it difficult to get support. I was just listening to a story today about a couple in Los Angeles who lost their home in the fire.
Mm.
And they have support for temporary housing, but FEMA hasn't given any funds to help them rebuild.
Yeah.
And so they're doing a go. Again, this comes back to the GoFundMe world
Yeah.
we're in when people
Hmm.
have healthcare crises and so
Right,
on.
right. Hmm.
And so I would like to see us be more proactive on that front and say, look, we know if these cuts go through with the ACA, that more and more people are going to lose their health care. They're
Yeah.
going to need help, you know. And so those of us who have means need to be putting more into the system. And it's kind of
Mm-hmm.
like taxing ourselves. And
Yeah.
but it's not just taxing ourselves in terms of money, it's taxing ourselves in terms of time.
Right.
And we need to build those systems of community support so
Hmm.
that uh you know because like I said, if people are falling through the cracks, we're losing people who are critical to supporting our kids and you know just our economic system more
Hmm.
generally. We can't
Yeah.
afford to, and unfortunately where we're really going to see things hurting is in agriculture is going to be a mess,
Right. Right.
with losing so many workers and farmers losing contracts and so on. And that's going to be a more difficult situation. uh and it's um you know that's a big problem. So that's
Hmm.
why I really think it's important to focus on the smaller problems that we can really try to address.
Yeah. Looks like we have another question here. If you had to describe the ideal change or outcome you hope readers will experience when they finish your new book, what would that be? Are there specific examples of social or political shifts that Reckoning aims to support or inspire?
Um, I guess what I would really love to see is more people becoming involved in politics more generally. I want to see
Mhm.
more people voting. I want to see more people running for office. I want to
Right.
see more people volunteering.
Hmm.
That is probably one of the most important things we need to focus on in the next year
Hmm.
is make because I imagine there's a big chunk of those 7 million people who are at the No Kings protest who didn't vote.
Right.
Um,
And I think
and
the converse is true too. Like, I think there have been political scientists talking about the correlation between people who do go to a protest and their likelihood to vote. And
right.
I think it's the 3.5% principle is what I heard, where like if that percentage of your population is actively protesting, that's where you start, especially non-violently protesting.
Hmm.
That's where you start to see almost like a bottom-up um,
Hmm.
political movement that typically translates to general elections and other
Hmm.
things.
Yeah, I think that's right. And, you know, but I'm not gonna, you know, count on that. I
Yeah.
think those of us who care need to be out there encouraging people to vote. I live in British Columbia part of the time, so I've joined Democrats Abroad. And actually, before the protest on Saturday, I went to a meeting, and one of the goals is to get more people who live abroad to vote.
And
Um,
hang on a second. What was your protest fit? Like, what did you, were you in a t inflatable toad? Like, what did you
No,
go
no, no, no,
for?
no. I went for Wonder Woman.
Okay. That's, that's in character. That makes sense. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. So, and I guess, the underlying theme in terms of the broader book itself is that it is possible to create change. And I'm trying to, because I guess what I'm really trying to focus on, here's some examples of how people created change.
Hmm.
And it's a cycle, right? It's not like you can, it's not a one-off. We saw in US politics there was Trump and then Biden and now Trump again.
Hmm.
And uh it's an interesting situation where there's so much uncertainty right now, right? And and Stephanie's asking, what do you think will move people to get out and vote or volunteer? It's what I said earlier. People need to understand that they have skin in the game, that this is impacting them. You know, when somebody tells you, I'm not interested in politics, I always say politics is interested in you.
Mm. Yeah.
So, um,
And also to
and
to your empathy point, it's that whole like, first they came for someone else. It's like if you can empathize for someone who has had their habeas corpus, like they've just been taken prisoner. Maybe it's not you, but like if you empathize with what that might be like, that actually could be motivational for you to go out to a protest, or
mhm,
to start to take action yourself.
mhm.
And, it's almost as though more folks are going to be feeling it directly. And then through this, radical empathy that you're describing, more folks I guess we need to tell the stories and make sure that the visibility and the transparency is there so that it actually like activates more empathy in people.
Yeah. Well, that's why, and Stephanie, I encourage you to get the book because I talk about that transition from apathy to empathy. There's this whole bystander syndrome
Mm,
that people, if nobody is, that's why the protests are so important.
right,
So if, say you're, like the situation we've had recently where a woman got stabbed on a bus or in the subway, whatever it was, well, probably both of those things have happened. If nobody does anything, then everybody is kind of like frozen. But if
right.
one person steps
Mm,
up and does something, then
mm,
people are more likely to become involved.
yeah,
And so, we need to get out of bystander mode and into active mode.
right.
And, and
Courage is a word I hear a lot too. Like it's a
yeah,
time for courage.
well, and people also need to let people know what they're doing, and to say, hey, I'm going to this event. Do you want to join me? I'm going to
Hmm.
this march. Do you want to come with me? There's
Right.
there's strength in, doing things with other people.
Hmm.
And that's why I think things like the souls to the polls during the elections, was important, where the churches would, go from church directly to the polling booth, and
Right, right.
and and it's not telling people how to vote. It's just saying we want you to vote, you
Hmm.
know.
Yeah.
Um, and I want to get to Amy's question. Do you think we will need to get a general strike in order to affect change in the US? And I don't think I don't know. I'm kind of pessimistic about the prospects for a general strike, because it's incredibly, if you think about countries that have been able to do general strikes, it's like, I can think of France, and even there,
Yeah.
it's not,
Spain
you don't
too
get,
sometimes. Yeah.
yeah, you don't get everybody to strike, obviously. Yeah, and I know that's not what you're saying, but logistically, that is extremely difficult. Um, and I mean, things have been tried like a day without a Mexican, and so
Yeah.
on, and those haven't had that much impact. So I
The Jimmy Kimmel thing is interesting though, in that
yes,
like there was collective action and there are lines that when crossed, there it can hit the corporation's wallet book in a
hmm
way their P&L in a way that I think is kind of interesting, and that's where I do wonder, is it a because the general strike, I think the somewhere between the general strike and like the targeted boycotting is
hmm
probably where this lands, where like the collective action and the sort of people to the streets hits numbers, and the level to which it was underreporting was striking to underreported was striking to me, where the estimates I'm hearing is like 7 million people participated. Like
hmm
that's a massive collective action, these people taking to the streets across the US, and for it to be like below the fold in the New York Times was
Well,
pretty.
unfortunately, yeah, it's not surprising these days that the New York Times, it was like on page 23 or something.
But I mean, I guess it's telling is another way to, even if it's not
Yeah.
surprising, like, those editorial choices continue to get made, and it's also the current administration's kind of pushing for those types of decisions to be made, obviously. Um, and then for the response to be dropping like the video
Oh God.
of
The
Trump
AI
drop.
video of Trump.
Oh
Yeah.
my God. Well, it's almost like
Well,
there it's almost like trolling empathy. You know, it's like the opposite of saying like, as president, my people are taking to the streets. How do I like? It's like the old Bill Clinton, like I feel your pain. This is kind of
Hmm.
like the absolute opposite of empathy.
Hmm.
Um, isn't empathy good politics? That's where I don't understand.
Yes. Well, we live at a very interesting time, and I think I have to always mention the work of my colleague Cynthia Miller Idris at American University. She's doing fantastic work around how particularly young men are radicalized and how to de-radicalize them, and also the misogyny and other things that are going on in that in the world of social media. And so I think one of the things we have to take into account is that a lot, we have these silos where, and I see it all the time on social media where, people have different versions of reality.
Yeah.
And I saw a friend in an exchange with somebody who was like, well, yeah, my business is being hurt and all this, but I still support, the president. And I think it's part of it is that um it's uh it's hard to break through those barriers. And so we have to look at this as a long game.
Hmm.
And one of the things I think is really critically important is that our leadership I'm not happy with our current Democratic Party leadership.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people are unhappy because they are being very timid in their approach to this. I look at actually,
Democratic Party leadership used to not be an oxymoron, and now,
right.
yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I look at Gavin Newsom and I think he's found a good niche for, the response, and he's
Pritzker
standing,
too, please.
and Pritzker, and
Yeah.
it's really interesting that the leadership has shifted to the governors.
Yeah.
And I think that comes back to the question about the general strike is,
Mm.
we rather than a general strike, I think we need the governors of states that are of a like mind to work together. I think it was Pritzker who was saying he was going to pull out of the Governors Association. And I think it's things like that that need to happen. We need to start making those institutions accountable, um, and saying, look, this we are not upholding the law, et cetera, et cetera. So um, that's I think that we I mean if you think about how badly things are stacked against us, creating change with this from the Supreme Court to you know all of our executive institutions, this is a long haul game. And
Hmm.
uh it's the hard part is going to be maintaining the energy from things
Yeah.
like the No King's March.
Right. And I think we have a few more questions coming in, but
Yes.
it also does remind me of like your book's very much about reframing, like this why I said post backlash. It's like there have been successful anti-racist activities that have happened and people forget to focus on them. People don't necessarily
Hmm.
understand what's actually been working because the prevailing narrative is like, oh, DEI woke went too far and now the backlash has won. Like that's unlikely to be the end of the story. Things
Hmm.
continue to evolve, and it almost felt like you were trying to get us to like a new paradigm. Like, okay, we heard that story. What's the next chapter?
Exactly. And I think it's hard to figure out what the end is going to look like when you're in the middle of it. So the thing that keeps me going when I get frustrated is the fact that I look back at my parents. Who my dad was born in 1928, mom was born in 1930. They both passed away, but they grew up during the Depression. Their first experience as young people was World War II. My dad joined the military in the 1950s, and we were living through the Cold War and the Korean
Hmm.
War and all of that.
Yeah. Hmm.
And you talk about uncertainty. I can't imagine what it was like living in the early 1940s or late 1930s when nobody knew what the outcome of the war was going to be. And
Right.
I don't think it's as, we're not, at least here in the US at war, but we are in a situation of huge uncertainty. And we have to be inspired by the examples of courage of people who were living during that time.
Yeah.
And so I'll come back to Jennifer's question is what do you say to people who want to help make change but are afraid? I mean, there's tons of things you can do that don't put you out there. You know, you can be donating, you can be supporting organizations. You can find local people who need help. There's so much that can be done that doesn't put you on the front lines. And,
Hmm.
I want to make sure I mention, a lot of Black women in particular, since 92% was, I think it was higher than that, but 90 something percent of us voted in a different way than what ended up being the outcome. And a lot of us, people are sitting, Black women in particular, sitting back and saying, we've done our job.
Yeah.
And I think what's really interesting to see is that when I go out to these protests, it's the vast majority of people are white or
Mm.
of other backgrounds,
Yeah.
and people are, well, where are the wet Black people? It's like, well, we're letting we don't want to put our so it comes back to Jennifer's question. A lot of us are saying we cannot put ourselves on the front line. You can't ask a person who's
Right.
in the U.S. undocumented to go and
Yeah.
be in the
Yeah,
front of
exactly.
these
Like brown
protests.
is brown is almost riskier than black in some contexts now,
Yes.
especially at these protests. Yeah.
And that's exactly why we need our allies who are privileged, who aren't as worried about, being arrested. And there were no arrests,
Right.
as far as I know.
Yeah.
There were some arrests of MAGA people who were trying to disrupt the protest, but
Right.
it was a very peaceful protest. And I think part of the reason for that is because, I think, no, there's a lot of, I'm not going to get into all the reasons for that, but it is critically important that our allies who have privilege are out there.
Right.
And people who are afraid should need to find other ways of, having impact.
Yeah. And it kind of gets
And
back to your idea too, where like people in a privileged state may not be aware, and that leads to the apathy, or maybe they're aware and they just don't want to, it's too complex, it's a mess, I don't want to deal with it, so they're apathetic. But then if you can kind of connect to them, if they can connect to the humanity of the people who are suffering,
mhm.
like best case that drives the collective, the broader action that we need to actually tip the scales.
And yeah, Stephanie gives us a fantastic example where she said there were bikers in Chicago are buying up all the tamale vendors' stock so they aren't on the street at risk. I think that's a fantastic example of mutual aid.
Yeah.
Perfect example of mutual aid, right?
Plus good Chicago street food. I mean,
Well,
that's pretty good.
tamales, you can't
Yeah.
beat that. But I
Yeah.
want to come back to the question. Can you share some examples from your experience where you successfully practiced radical empathy for someone whose beliefs or actions you strongly disagreed with? I can tell you that that happens all the time in the classroom.
Yeah.
um, and uh, I have to work really hard in the classroom to make sure I'm creating a space where any student, regardless of their background or beliefs, feels like they can participate. And it definitely impacts and changes the way that I teach. It changes the way that, I mean, writing the book Radical Empathy, like, it only had a personal impact on me, had an impact on the way that I teach. It had an impact on the way that I interact with people.
It's a very personal book.
Yeah, it is absolutely. And that's why, reckoning is trying to pull it out of the personal and bring it into more of the public realm. And the work that I do, I mean, I'm working all the time with people who don't agree with my beliefs
Yeah.
and so on. And
I thought the Katie
you know,
Porter kerfuffle out in California was interesting too, because it there were notes of like the deplorables and like,
mhm.
which in some ways a lot of this does come back to that like politics of inclusion versus exclusion. And, I think the surprise, it's almost, the guy in Maine now I saw was just almost like trying to reach out to like trying to empathize with what it's like to be brainwashed, part of like which I think it might be, you kind of want to be careful with if you're trying to empathize, people don't think of themselves as brainwashed,
No,
but like,
I mean, that's part of the problem is the terminology we use and the
yeah.
way we address people. I mean,
Hmm.
I think coming back to that question, first of all, we have to take a step back and rethink our assumptions about the people. So we see somebody and they say something and we always have these judgments, right? And That's why I think it's so important to take a step back, first of all, and say, wait, what assumptions am I making about this person?
Hmm.
Right. And that's exactly what I do in the classroom
Yeah.
is I hear a student say something and I'm like, well, this is an opportunity for me to find out more. Let
Right.
me ask some questions here. And as you can see in the a lot of the examples I provide, a lot of times it takes leadership in an organization or us as individuals to take a step back and say, what are we missing? Right? What part of the picture are we not seeing?
Yeah.
Um, and a lot that's why having those diverse views, talking to people, asking questions, finding out what their real perspectives are, can sometimes, help us chip away at some of those beliefs. And if I can just get a student to understand the history and understand that this is real, these are facts, that's a big part of the way towards getting them to think more critically about what they're being fed on social
Yeah.
media and so on.
I've heard it called fearless listening, like being open to hear things that you might not want to hear, and then
Hmm.
modeling this is how I respond when people who know me understand my values, understands that I'm hearing something that I'm not comfortable with. Now what do I do with that? And there's almost the easier moves to kind of virtue signal or about your side or show your outrage for like how wrong that is versus like pausing and like reflecting a little bit more and trying to understand like what's the next step when I choose to make that kind of a move? Thoughts on that? I know we're getting close to time, but like you're someone who is pretty heroic in life in general, but also on social media, which a
Hmm.
lot of people are just exiting and like talking about how it is the
Well, I
problem.
exited Twitter
Okay, well,
slash
yeah, a
X.
lot of people do that.
I
Yeah,
got
yeah,
out of that mess years ago.
yeah, yeah,
Um, I'm not gonna. I'm not. I don't consider myself a punching bag, so I'm not out there trying to
yeah.
engage with people who are purposely trying to antagonize.
Right, right.
So I have a very curated social media presence for the most part. I mean, um
Some serious
I
shoes. I mean, there's a lot. Is your shoe has your shoe endorsement come through yet?
Well, I have to admit, I am a big fan of Fluvog shoes based here in Vancouver, British
Yeah.
Columbia, and I am
Uh-huh.
wearing my Fluvogs today. I'll
Oh
post a
yeah.
picture later.
There you go.
Um, and I do have a shoe named after me, but I don't get any monetary return from that, unfortunately.
That's like your Jordans. Yeah.
Yeah, the Givens. We
Yeah.
have the Givens.
There you go.
But that's a really fun, that's a great example though of a community. I just ran into, we call ourselves Fluvies. And actually, I'll be having an event here in Vancouver on November the 20th, I believe. It's a Friday at the Fluvag store in Kitsilano, BC. So if you're in
Oh,
Vancouver,
cool.
come and check it out.
Nice.
I'll be doing a book signing, but yeah, it's a good example of community because we all come from very different backgrounds and so on, and we have one thing that we really like, which is the shoes, and um, it's been a nice community to be part of here in Vancouver. But
I believe it was Mars Blackman who said it's got to be the shoes.
yes, 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 the shoes are important here.
Yeah.
I'll show. I'll hold up
Oh
the ones I'm
wow.
wearing
Oh man,
today.
this is like bonus content, people. Not everyone always gets to see
Woohoo!
stylish, stylish.
Yes.
What haven't we got to? What else did you want to make sure? Thanks to everyone who's the questions have been amazing. If folks have any final stuff you want to get in here, it's been great having that level of interactivity. Great questions really throughout. But if there's anything you want to make sure folks heard before we wrap up here, what else? What
Yeah,
haven't we
since we
talked about?
started a little late due to
Yeah.
our technical difficulties, we'll stay on a few more minutes. I know people may have to go. But in any case, yeah, I just would like to encourage folks to think about, what's something I can do on a daily basis. And when I started kind of my own radical empathy practice, some of the things I do are very simple. Like when I get on a plane, I thank the flight attendants because I know, especially during COVID, how difficult it was for them.
Yeah.
I think about how people are being impacted by various things that are going on in the world. And one of my big things I'm committed to as a volunteer and community member, and so I've also spent a lot of time down in California, is supporting youth. And
Yep.
so I've been involved in a lot of youth organizations. I'm on the board of my
Hmm.
high school because I'm Gonzaga Prep in Spokane, Washington, because I
Hmm.
really care about young people. And
Hmm.
and I was really helped a lot by the folks at my high schools and
Hmm.
others. And one thing I'm looking into is trying to support more young people, in like middle school, like seventh, eighth grade, who want to be athletes. And I was an athlete,
Right.
of course, growing up. And but
Right.
the landscape has changed.
D1 D1 Stanford Cardinal, I believe.
Yes. Track and field. And actually, I just signed up to join a new mentoring program. They're starting there.
Oh,
But
cool.
yeah, but so being a mentor is a huge thing to me. And so one of the things I'm going to focus in on is how do we help these kids who are really talented, both academically and athletically, before they get to high school, right?
Hmm.
And start giving them some support so that when they do get to high school, they know what they need to do. California is a very complex situation around that. If you want to go to college, you have to complete these A through G requirements, and a lot of
Mm,
kids whose parents might be immigrants or from backgrounds
right.
where they didn't go to college might
First
not
generation,
understand.
right? Hmm.
Yeah, they don't understand how to get through that whole system, and
Yeah.
then they get done with high school and they don't have anywhere to go. So
Right.
um and of course the landscape, we have to have a whole nother conversation about the landscape with changing with NIL and all of that.
Oh my
Even just
God.
to oh my God, even just
I'm
setting.
ready to bring This Week in Higher Ed back. We could call it whatever you want, Terry.
Yeah.
I'm just a Zoom call away for sure.
Yes, indeed. And but just to sign up to be a mentor for student athletes, you have
Hmm.
to go through all these. I understand the NIL, all the
Oh my
it's
God.
funny because I think the goal of the whole NIL situation was to make things easier
Right.
for student athletes, but actually it's just complicated things.
Yeah. I mean,
Um,
there were goals around like equity that were noble, I think, or at least just like fairness that people get paid for the work that they're doing. But the actual reality on the ground now is I don't know. I mean, that's a whole nother, that'd be a heck of a conversation because there's plenty to get into there. But yeah, it doesn't seem like the solution is fully baked yet. It feels like we're figuring it out as we go.
Oh God, yes.
Yeah.
Anyway, one last question. Do you think the people who most need your book are likely to read it? How do we get the message
Mm,
out? Well, go and do a review on Amazon, and Goodreads. And, I'm not, Pollyannish about it. I think a lot of people who need this book won't read it. But the people who, um, are likely to read it can help spread the word, right?
yeah.
I don't necessarily need everybody to read this book, but
Hmm.
I'm hoping that we get enough critical mass. And that's what the whole thing about the no kings and the 3.5%,
Yep.
et cetera. It's all about critical mass. And
Hmm.
that's why I have been on social media almost every day,
Yeah.
talking about the book, talking about how we create change. That's why I wrote the books. And I mean, I have had so many people come up to me and talk and say, "Oh, I read your book, Radical Empathy, and it had such a
Yeah.
huge impact on me." And I think that if I could say one thing, Darren, it is that I want to empower people. And thanks, Renee. Um, is we have to give people their power back, right?
Yeah.
And if I can do one thing, and then I feel so incredibly blessed and lucky to be somebody who is in the classroom and can see students coming into their power.
Yeah.
And if I can do that for just a few people, and it's like people know I've been a vice provost and a provost and all this, all these but to me, at the end of my career, people go, why don't you want to be a college president? For one thing, all I have to do is say two words, Claudine Gay.
Right,
But
right.
uh, the second thing is that I want to, the last however many years I have left in my career, I want to be focused on teaching, and
Yeah.
I want to
Mentoring,
be,
coaching. Yeah.
yes, helping students and helping other leaders.
Hmm.
I end up in doing. I'll be in a meeting later today where I'm going to be doing some of that.
Right.
Um,
Because leadership development's another angle that, if you were to kind of abstract out of like the DEI context, like a lot of what you're talking about is just like good leadership, good culture building, good sort of team building. You want to get buy-in. Like there's disengagement
mhm.
problems, you know, people in more senior roles are trying to figure out how do I connect with Gen Z, maybe empathize with them to start, like listen to them, try to
No, no,
understand.
no. Practicing empathy is step number four. The first
Oh,
step is be vulnerable
yeah,
and
yeah.
understand yourself
Uh,
and be open to the experiences of others
all
before you
that.
start practicing empathy.
All that. But my point is more like empathy is not a dirty word, and like
No,
especially if you're trying to figure out how to engage, like and it's also not to your point prior, like it's not the end result that you're seeking, but like
right.
if you can kind of build a culture that people feel connected to because they feel like they matter, they feel like they're kind of their voice is heard in some way. That's like just good leadership, period.
Hmm. Absolutely. And we need it more than ever.
Yeah.
I'll leave it at that because,
Yeah.
if there's one thing I want people to leave, well, actually, not one thing. There's three things I want people to leave with is first of all, we need to empower each other.
I thought it was by the
Second,
book.
oh, sorry. Well, that's an obvious one.
Okay. Got
Buy
it.
the
Got
book,
it.
empower
Yeah.
each other by buying the book.
Yeah.
Make focus on yourself. Yay, thanks, Amy, bought the book. Um, you know, Focus on yourself and understanding yourself before you start judging others. And then empathy is a practice. It's not an end goal.
Mm.
And you know, start small if you're afraid or if you feel like you don't know what to do. First of all, I've got lots of both radical empathy and reckoning. There's all kinds of things I talk about that you can do that can kind of put you gradually into a space where you feel like you can do even more to create change, right?
Yeah.
So that's my the advice I will leave you with. And thank you so much to everybody who joined us today. There'll be lots more opportunities to. We're doing podcasts. We're going to be doing some live events, and I'll be sharing those on social media if you're interested in being part of my
Is there a
launch.
website people should go to?
Yes, terrigivens.com.
There you go.
www.terrigivens.com. And Brian, thank you so much. Jennifer, Amy, Darren. I can't say it. I won't go through all your names, but thank you so much. Renee also. Thanks to everybody. And please spread the word. And yeah, thanks for your support, Mike. We always have a fun time.
This is
And
blast. Yeah, congrats.
yes.
This is awesome.
And yeah, we'll be catching up with everybody soon. Okay, so Earl, let's end the recording.